What's wrong with DEI? What's right with it? And why should the church care? That's coming up. Hello, and welcome to Church in Maine, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. You know, they're just three letters, D, E, and I. And yet, those three letters either strike fear in the hearts of some or in others. It's a necessary part of a society that is filled with people from various backgrounds. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have been a part of the political debate for probably almost a decade now. But especially since Donald Trump became president again in January, the argument has basically gone into overdrive, with the administration going after schools, law firms, and private businesses for supposedly having DEI programs and for discriminating, not against people of color, but in this case against whites. So what is DEI? Are progressives correct that diversity, equity, and inclusion are Christian values, like one meme says? Or is DEI some form of reverse discrimination, as MAGA conservatives believe? And what does the church have to say about all of this? To answer these questions, I invited George Yancey back to this podcast. Yancey is a professor of sociology and religion at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He's also the author of the book Beyond Racial Division. It's a great book that talks about race and racial reconciliation. I think that his nuanced view on DEI is something that we need to hear today. We also talk about something related, and that is the move by the Trump administration to remove images and in some cases rewrite or remove references related to women and persons of color, and they're using DEI as an excuse. Now, before we start this conversation, I wanted to let you know that there were some issues during the recording that couldn't be fixed. So if George's audio seems off, that's why. Now that I have said that, please join me in this conversation with George Yancey. All right. Well, thank you for coming back on to the podcast. And I think the first thing we wanted to do is talk a little bit just for people who haven't heard you the last time you were on the podcast, is to learn a little bit about you, especially your faith background. Kind of what were things like for you, or your religious background growing up, and then your position at Baylor.
So I became a Christian when I was 19 in college. I grew up in the church. If you're an African American my age, you had to grow up in the church. You didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in the church, but it never really took. It's all that trying to do good in order to earn God's, gift of heaven, which of course that's not what it's about. I didn't really fully understand that until I was 19. So in college, I did become a Christian, born again, and through the efforts of the Southern Baptist. Had a college ministry, I was able to be discipled and to grow closer. And then being a Christian and going into grad school, that's a trip. And one that, you have to be called towards. And fortunately I was. It helped to shape my faith in some very critical ways. uh, didn't challenge the core of what I believe, but how I applied it. Try to apply more nuance, less dogmatic way. And I'm not saying there's not right and wrong. There is right and wrong, but to appreciate some of the shades of gray that I think sometimes Christians don't appreciate.
Hmm.
Uh, and so that sort of helped shape me. I got my PhD from UT Austin in sociology. Uh, I didn't start out studying racial issues. In fact, I was studying epistemology. I actually wasn't that interested in racial issues until late into my graduate career. I had some
Hmm.
personal things happen that really got me into looking at racial issues. But by then, I started my dissertation on something else. And you don't stop your dissertation. Well, you shouldn't stop your dissertation. I tell my students, you don't stop your dissertation, just get it done. Uh, but after I got my PhD degree, I became interested in studying issues, racial issues, interracial marriage, racial identity, that sort of stuff. So that's kind of my background of where I've come from and who I am.
All right. Well, I wanted to talk to you because you back earlier this year wrote a series of tweets on Twitter that were kind of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, especially regarding an executive order that President Trump came out with. And since then, there's kind of been a lot of interesting things happening concerning DEI,
Yeah,
especially its definition. And it's kind of interesting because on one hand, people, when they talk about DEI, they're including everything from a something as simple as a cutout for wheelchair accessibility
yeah,
to something on the other side where you have the Defense Department taking down something from about Jackie Robinson and saying that's DEI. And so it seems like it's just this really huge definition of what it is. And so I guess my first question is, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? What is it truly, and what is
yeah,
it not?
sure. So, I mean, there is a sense where DEI becomes what a person defines it, because basically
Hmm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion is attempts to create diversity, equity, and inclusion. Uh, I do fear that conservatives are putting themselves in a position that the left have put themselves in and making the same mistake. The left define everything as racist. If you disagree with me
Hmm.
on affirmative action, that's an example of white supremacy. And pretty soon nothing became racist. And now when the left says that's racist, people go, okay, well, you call me a racist because I don't agree with hate crime legislation. So why should I care what you call the skinhead a racist?
Hmm.
I think the conservatives are doing that a little bit with DEI. They're making everything DEI, and therefore nothing becomes DEI. Where, and I think that there is a critique in the way in which we do diversity training. There's a strong critique in the way we have done diversity training. And we should address that critique. My fear is that the to address critique is to say, let's get rid of DEI, and then everything becomes DEI. So if you bring up anything that's racial, then no, that's DEI. We don't talk about that. They're doing the same thing with CRT just a couple of years ago. I guess they just changed the terminology. That's CRT, let's get rid of it. So I guess we got to find something to paint as that this is on racial issues, let's get rid of it. And I think that that's what the right is doing. So
Hmm.
you have to define DEI. Uh, you know, there's not a nice, neat little definition. So I will just basically define it as an attempt to create an atmosphere where people of different races can can flourish.
Hmm.
Uh, this now that sounds great, and some people are going to say, "Well, what about doing this and this and this, which is not so great?" And I will say that some of these attempts are not great, and it's not just my opinion. Research shows that some of these we do in the name of diversity are not great and make the problems worse. And I'm all for a real critique of what we're doing. What I'm not for is just saying, let's not do anything. Because just to sort of, I'm putting a lot in that probably needs more background. But the really big question we have in our society today is how do we deal with centuries of racial abuse in a way that everyone thinks is fair?
Hmm.
Uh, Everyone agrees. almost everyone agrees there's been centuries of racial abuse. And almost everyone agrees that those same mechanisms are not in place today. We don't have slavery today. We don't have Jim Crow. We don't have reservations for Native Americans today that we're forcing them on it. So how do we deal with that? That's a really important question. And there is a sense where it's where people want it to be. I mean, the basic idea is to create an atmosphere of acceptance for people across the racial groups. Uh, can people do it in a bad way? Absolutely. Is there research showing that some of the ways we try to do diversity backfires, creates a backlash? Absolutely. Is DI beyond critique? Absolutely not. But the effort to create an atmosphere, that's important. Uh, the big question today is not whether or not people of color are fully human. Hardly anyone says that we're not. The big question is, how do we deal with centuries of racial abuse in a way that people can find acceptable? DEI can be a way in which we can deal with this racial abuse. The answer is not to ignore all that, nor is the answer, on the other hand, is to go overboard the other way, which justifiably some people think that has happened. Mm-hmm. The answer is to find a new, nuanced way in which we can answer this question and do so in a way that's helpful for everyone. And I fear that on both sides we're not doing that. We haven't been doing that with some of these DEI efforts. Although I have seen some that are very good, and we're not doing it if we just wipe them all out.
Mm-hmm. Do you think are there some examples of? Well, I guess maybe let's ask this first. What have been the examples of where it hasn't worked? Because there have actually over the last few months been some interesting stories on in the media about, and I think there was a big story in the New York Times about the University of Michigan of certain things that it didn't work. It didn't seem to do as well as possible. What are some examples and why didn't it work?
What tells us that there's a study out there that shows a meta-analysis that shows that diversity programs tend to create a short-term reduction of prejudice, but long-term doesn't have any effect. Mm-hmm. There's studies that show that when you just put some speaker out there who pontificates and give information, that's not very useful. And depending on how they do it, it can create a backlash. Study out there showing that teaching about white privilege actually creates less sympathy for marginalized whites, but does not increase sympathy for marginalized people of color. So a really famous study out there shows that mandatory diversity training, that using that in order to increase the number of minorities who are going to be managers, you're going to hire as managers, actually the reverse happens. When it was mandatory and you force people to undergo it, you have fewer managers of color 5 years later. So there's a lot of research showing that, my thinking is that if we put some speaker out there who goes around and talks about, white supremacy and ending whiteness, that probably doesn't work. It creates resentment. There's research showing that if you use social justice as a justification to hire people, then people look at those people and they say they're not qualified. They say it's not qualified. So you create a lot of resentment. You create a lot of hostility, and that's the opposite of creating a hospitable atmosphere. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I mean, I think we have to take a serious look at how we do DEI, and I wish the Trump administration would say, look, a lot of this stuff is not good. Sometimes even garbage. What we want to do is figure out what works, what doesn't, and put the money into what works and take the money out for what doesn't. Had he done that, yes, he's going to get criticized because he's Trump, but I would actually stay with him and say, you know what? That's a good attitude to have. Let's do that. Instead of what's happening now, which is let's just tear everything apart.
Why do you think that there is that desire just to tear everything down? I mean, I think there was some hope, maybe after the election and before the inauguration, that there might be some kind of more common sense things, but not what we're seeing, which seems to be kind of what it seems like to be a wholesale, just tearing everything down. and to not even want to deal with any problems that might have resulted as because of our past, and how do we kind of welcome a more kind of and deal with a more diverse society. But there just has been this desire to just kind of take a bulldozer to it. Why do you think that that has been the sentiment?
To fairly answer that question, we have to look at a wider context. And so I think to fairly answer that question, we should go back to 2020,
Mm.
where we had George Floyd, Albury, we had all the protests. And if you probably remember, everything became anti-racist.
Yeah.
Anti-racist became the key word. Anti-racist this, anti-racist that. And a lot of the bad ways of doing DEI was done in that period of time. This is where you get some of the people like Tim Wise and D'Angelo talking about white fragility and things of this nature. At that point in time, the people who were very supportive of this effort had the cultural power. No one wanted to stand up and say, "Look, this may not be a good thing to do it this way," because then you're accused of either being a racist if you're white, or white adjacent if you're not white. I've been accused of being too nice to white people when I say this isn't the good way of approaching this. So that was 2020. All right. 2021, we have a backlash against this. We have all the protests at the school board meetings. The Virginia governor, was it Youngkins?
Mm-hmm.
I believe he won the governorship because of that backlash. You had this sort of backlash towards it. And so now you have this big fight in 2024. You've had the people with cultural power imposing anti-racism and a sort of DEI approach on people. And you have the backlash. Trump wins that battle. A lot of factors are going into it. People are saying it's unfair. People are able to trot out the worst excesses of it. And like I said, if done badly, you get a backlash. Trump wins. And so with this cultural power, in a sense, the Republicans are doing what the Democrats did. Democrats had cultural power, so they imposed their version of anti-racism on others. The Republicans are now imposing their version of getting rid of everything on others. And what they're doing is they're setting up backlash against themselves. And that's what's going to happen. Eventually, I don't claim to have the gift of prophecy, but eventually there's going to be this backlash against what Trump and others are doing. And when those people get power, they'll set up their own system and they'll say, "Hey, now everyone has to do what we want." Until we begin to talk to each other instead of trying to overpower each other, this is the cycle we're going to be in. One group's going to get power, and then they're going to impose their will until the other group gains power, and then they'll impose their will. Instead of trying to figure out what works, what doesn't, why do you not like this? Why do you like this? How can we find solutions where everyone can at least get something out of it? Until we do that, this pattern is going to continue to go on.
Yeah, it does seem that that is a big problem, is that we don't know how to talk to each other about these issues. And then I may even go as far as to say that we're afraid of talking to each other on these issues. So I think one question that I would have is, if it were to say on the Trump side, it's that DEI is just all bad all around. But you said earlier that there were some examples of ways that it has worked, that have been helpful. What examples do you have about that?
And so research shows that when the diversity training engages people in order to understand others, in other words, takes the role of others, that's more effective. When diversity training is not about just being taught, but developing skills, that has a more positive outcome. I've seen a couple of programs that are talking about how do we communicate better with one another. Those are going to have more positive outcomes. People leave those programs not resentful, but having gained insight and a set of skills. So programs that do this, and they do exist. I don't know if they're a majority or what percentage of the programs, but they do exist. Those programs have been shown. Something called intercultural dialogue has been shown to be effective, and it has a lot of these same elements. The elements of talking, teaching people how to communicate with one another, of learning how to listen to one another, finding solutions that we can live together. Those are the sort of programs that can work. Ideally, we would get a president one day that will say, "Hey, let's try to use these programs. Let's emphasize these sort of programs. Let's not get rid of everything. Let's not go back to the Tim Wises of the world. Let's try to work together."
So, where do you think that the role of the church fits into all of this, and even really kind of the role of the Christian faith fits into all of
Mm.
this? A friend of mine and colleague has written some articles about DEI and some of the experiences that he has gone through. And one of the things that he has really kind of learned, and I think I would agree with him, is that sometimes the way that it has been presented and the experiences, there isn't a lot of grace.
Hmm.
There's this kind of almost a fear that you have to be perfect, and if you make a mistake, that's the end of it,
Yeah.
and that there hasn't been that kind of room for really being able to make mistakes and kind of come together and work on this together instead of more of a top down, almost feels like a top down solution.
Yeah, I agree. What people call cancel culture has made people fearful of even trying anything because if you say something wrong, then people will try to cancel you. And some people blow it off. Oh, you're just losing your job. That's no big deal. Which most of us at the job know that is a big deal. But the way cancel culture has been is you don't just lose your job. You also get sort of blackballed and even doxxed at times. And so
Mhm.
there's a high cost to making conversation where we should make it a low cost to have honest conversations. And so I think that's part of it. Uh, I know it's a sensitive issue, and I know that their feelings can be raw. Uh, and sometimes we have to have compassion and let people, not try to take them too fast into things. Uh, but we got to have those conversations, or else we're going to just keep repeating what we're doing. The church, I believe, and I write in my book. I think that the Christian theology supports the approach I've talked about.
Mhm.
That when we look at human depravity, and when we think about human depravity and how none of us are going to put forth a plan that's perfect for everyone because we have our own interests at stake. When we think about those things, then it makes sense that what we need is conversations where we can work things out and not just running over everybody. So I do think the church has a role to play. If we could model these kind of conversations in a healthy way, that would set up something for the society to see. Unfortunately, we tend to imitate society rather than lead society. So I think we need to be leaders in this, and we've not been leaders in this.
Mhm. On the other side of that, it seems both with kind of the wider, I say, conservative movement, but even in probably more evangelical conservative churches, there have been examples of not handling the issue of race well as of late. Um, and sometimes, how do you handle with people who say that all the issues that we're dealing with race were something that were dealt with back in the 60s and that we don't really need to talk about that now? And or that, all we have to do is talk about merit, not about DEI. How do we handle that on the other side?
Thing to approach is to approach people and say, "Hey, can we have a conversation?" Because I think one of the mistakes people have made, and myself included, is we go and say, "Hey, why don't you listen to me? Have you seen this evidence? Why are you doing this?"
Mhm.
And of course, what that does is it puts people immediately on the defensive. So I think what we have to do is say, "Hey, those of us who are Christians, hey, I'm a brother in Christ, you're a brother or sister in Christ. Can we have a conversation on this? We're used hearing me, and I hear you, and I'll hear you out too." I think we need to start approaching that way. Once we get in that conversation, then we can begin to point out why just saying merit and saying everything was done in the 60s is not going to be satisfactory for us and why we need something. Now, what that something is, that's something where we have to sort of work it out with our brothers and sisters who disagree with us.
Mhm.
But they need to understand that when they just blow it all off, they're blowing off a part of who I am. When they say race doesn't matter, it's a part of who I am. Not the most important part, but a part of who I am. And so I think that I think we have to try to approach it in a way that's productive. And, uh, and if we don't approach it in ways that are productive, then all we're going to get is more pushback.
Hmm. Yeah, I think some of there was actually an article, and I think you may have even talked about it yourself, from John McWhorter, that talks about DEI, and basically his whole approach is to mend it, don't end it. Um, and one of the things that has been, I think, interesting about that is the focus on, especially anti-whiteness, has kind of been the in some programs has been the drive. And it thinks that with both of on both the kind of more progressive, but also the more conservative ends, is really not the desire to talk to one another. It's more, I'm here and I'm going to tell you, here's the truth. Um, and obviously on an issue that's this sensitive, that's not going to work.
You talked to conservatives, say about 3 or 4 years ago, when
Mm-hmm.
they felt like they were the ones being dumped on. Uh, you know, and some of them were trying to figure things out. They kind of realized that anti-racism was wrong, but something needed to be done. And so some of them, to be honest, was had a really legitimate. They wanted to figure it out. Uh, I'm finding it harder to talk to conservatives today because now they're the ones with power in this dimension. So it's going to take when one of the sides has power, but instead of using it to hold down the others, wants to use it to have a real conversation and to find common ground. I think that's going to be the main. I think that's going to be the. It's going to change everything. Uh, but I don't see that right now happening with the conservatives, and it didn't happen with the liberals, to be honest. But I don't see it
Mm-hmm.
happening with the conservatives right now.
Well, it almost sounds like to have a really good conversation, you're going to have an almost Christ-like mentality of giving up power, of
Yeah,
ceding power to be able to have that conversation.
I understand that.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the things that I also found interesting as of late, and I don't know, this has something to do with DEI, but also it's tangential,
Mhm.
is the most recent executive order that about American history, when this is
Yeah.
mostly focused on the Smithsonian. Um, and I think that there's a lot of, I mean, things have not been fleshed out yet, so you can't really just immediately jump to conclusions. But I think that there's some concerns there in how when we are telling and can tell history, um, and any kind of thought or worry about telling, things like about slavery, or um, how dealing with Native Americans might be considered divisive. Um, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that, and how do we, is there a way of negotiating on that issue?
I think that the issue that we put before people of different interests and try to hammer things out. Uh, as an African American, I need to hear from some of my white people why they're uncomfortable with some of the ways things are told.
Mm-hmm.
They need to hear from me why, yeah, we do have to include discussing slavery and Jim Crowism in the curriculum. Uh, I think eventually we'll find out is yes, we discuss those things, but we don't try to discuss them in an accusatory manner.
Mm-hmm.
You yeah, bad things happen in our country, and we acknowledge that, but we don't try to put that on people. I think if we found a way of doing it that way, I think we get a lot less of the conflict. Uh, it just does disturb me when I hear that, the Tuskegee Airmen, people don't want to teach that and stuff like that. But on the other hand, I do have to ask the question: how are we teaching it? Maybe the way it's taught is a way that creates more strife. So that a solution would be, yes, we teach it, but we teach it in a way that is not creating strife. I can live with that. I don't have to feel like, we're teaching about slavery to show how bad you white people are. I mean, I have no desire to do that whatsoever. But I think people need to know about slavery in order to understand. where blacks came from and some of the things that's happened to them, not just slavery, but Jim Crowism, what happened up north, or some of the violence done against African Americans as they try to move up north. Those things need to be acknowledged. Uh, and how we do it may, I'm open to how we do it. Uh, but in order to get an understanding of where people were at racially today, we have to understand our racial history, the history of the Native Americans. You know, we have to understand what happened there and how they, how the notion of manifest destiny was so horrific for them.
Mhm.
Uh, with what happened to the Hispanics and some degree Asian Americans, we need to understand that. So, so yeah, that's where I would come from on the history. I think I do think we need to have a conversation on what's our curriculum we're going to use and how we're going to do it, where everyone has input, and we try to meet everyone's interests. But yeah, from my point of view, it has to be taught. How it has to be taught, I think, is something that I'm very flexible on.
So it seems like a lot of what is, when we talk about race and especially racial reconciliation, that a lot of it has to deal with how we do it and not as much whether we do it or not. And I think the question as of late of how we do it is not well.
It's trust in our society on racial issues. It's hard to do it well, which is another reason why we have to have these conversations so we can hopefully gain a little bit more trust of each other.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think that this is heading in the next 10 years or so? Obviously beyond it, because I think it's not just what's happening in Washington. It's really something nationwide. And as I think you just alluded to, it has a lot to do with trust in our society and also what we hold in common. So where do you see this heading? But what are some solutions? How do we break out of this kind of what it seems like a doom loop?
Yeah. My, my big thing I've emphasized is some version of what I learned from the research, which is a collaborative conversation where we try to intentionally have conversations where we find solutions to problems.
Mm-hmm.
We have to change our mindset. Our mindset has to stop being, well, I need my side to get power so that we can then do this and change things. And I understand you think your side is correct and it's an honest belief that you have, but that's not going to be enough. Uh, so yeah, I think we have to start thinking along those lines. How can we have better conversations where everyone has a seat at the table, where we hear each other out and try to find solutions? That mindset will alter everything. If we keep this mindset of my side, my way or the highway, then yeah, it's the definition of insanity. The same thing over and over again, expect a different result.
Mm-hmm. Well, if people want to know more and want to chat with you more or even read more, where should they go?
Well, on my own website, georgeyancey.com,
Mhm.
Yancey. I work at Baylor, U.S. Department of Sociology. You want to contact me through that. The stuff I discuss on race came out in my latest book, Beyond Racial Division. So, I could flesh it out more like that. So on racial issues, that's my latest book that I would recommend.
And I will say I have read Beyond Racial Division, and I think it's a good book. And so I will
Thank you.
definitely urge others to read it. I think it's a helpful book for these times.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, Professor Yancey, thank you again for taking the time to chat, and I hope that we can do this again.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. I hope so too.
All right. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on this episode, especially your thoughts about DEI. Do you like it? Do you not? And why? Please feel free to send me an email I'd love to hear your responses. You can send it to churchandmain@substack.com. I'm also going to include links to Beyond Racial Division, the book, again, that George Yancey wrote, and also links to his bio. So if you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, please visit us at churchandmain.org. And you can also visit churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and please consider leaving a review. That does help others find this podcast. Well, that is it for this episode of Church and Main. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. As I like to say, thank you so much for listening. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.